different billing options and best practices around each of those. I'm going to talk about different system configurations and things to consider, as well as a couple different tips and tricks with some of the billing configurations, and then talk about some reports. Certainly there are a ton of reports, but wanted to highlight a few different ones. So our first topic here is the time and materials, especially when we're looking at varied user rates. In terms of the setup here, rate cards are probably one of the more common ways to set up time billing. However, there are occasions when you need to set up billing based on user rates. And you can set user rates at the user profile level, excuse me, and then if needed, depending on your contractual agreement then with your clients, if you need to override user rates, you can certainly do that here on the billing rule, on the time billing rule. And this is the same place that you would set up getting the option to bill from a rate card, which pulls from the job code. And then again, this is just an override. So in my example here, I've got Andrea set up as an override at $50 an hour. Maybe her default is $75 an hour that she bills out at, and I just need to change that based on this particular contract if you've got named users in there. Based on different configurations, if you have different rates for different users, you might need multiple billing rules per user, especially if each user or job code that user is associated with has a unique cap on the project. So if you say that one person you're allocating $5,000 for, another person you're allocating $1,000 for, it just might need to be different billing rules and have several billing rules. Looking at prepaid. So in the option that you've got a situation where your clients prepay, you need to bill a set amount out of OpenAir upon payment. You would set up two rules in order to do this in terms of reflecting the data. So the upfront payment would be handled as a retainer, or it can be applied as a credit to future invoices. You can also work from bucket of hours, and then so what you would do is set up a fixed fee on your date, for example, the date or milestone rule, and you could say maybe on November 10th, for example, bill out $10,000. And then if you wanted to show those hours worked on an invoice, and I have a sample invoice, you could set up a second rule then. It's a $0 rule. So you would set up a rate card where every user is every job code is associated with a $0 amount. And then what you could configure your invoice to show, for example, is the user's hours, and then it's got a rate of $0 because they've already been paid for based on that information. And then so you can have multiple then fixed fee and time combinations on a billing rule setup there. Hours that go over the prepaid amount or the cap, those are the ones that definitely need to be accounted for. While it is, I was going to pull up, I'll talk about that actually, and I've got a future slide here, a best practice on setting up a billing rule to capture anything that goes over that particular cap. So this is actually, this is actually a sample of the invoice and what the invoice would look like this is actually a retainer, I apologize, with a retainer, and you can set up a retainer, and when you're generating an invoice, you can pull that money from a retainer and say that, if someone's got maybe a $10,000 retainer, my bill is $6,900, and in this particular retainer, I'm going to go ahead and pull all the money from it so they don't owe me anything right now. And then up here it does tell me that I've got a balance of $3,100 on that invoice. And this is information that you can configure to display on your invoice. For prepaid hours scenario. This is the one where I wanted to talk about the $0 rate specifically as well. So if you've got a situation, again, where a customer paid $10,000, wants to see the hours worked on an invoice, you would set up a billing rule with your rate card. You'd have a couple different billing rules. You'd have your fixed fee billing rule for your prepay amount. You'd have that time billing rule for a $0 rate card based on your job codes, based on the number of hours, for example. And then I recommend always having a third billing rule, which is a time billing rule with perhaps your regular rate to cover any overages. It's not necessary or just isn't required, but let's say if you've got, someone prepaid, if they've got 1,000 hours and they have paid, once you hit that 1,000 hours, what happens? If you don't have that rule set up, they go out into kind of billing rule purgatory, where there's the time is still being entered and the time is queued up to generate as a charge, but if there's no rule to tell that time where to go and what to translate to in terms of dollars, it kind of sits out there in cyberspace. So again, that's why I always recommend having that third billing rule, a time billing rule, saying anything that's over maybe our 1,000 hours or our 50 hours in this example, maybe you're billing at $200 an hour to cover any sort of overages in those situations. Subscriptions, these are pretty straightforward, but OpenAir obviously can handle these. If you've got a situation where you're billing on a regular basis, one time a month, one time a quarter, for example, and you've got the same amount, you can set up the billing rule to bill out. In this example, I've got $10,000 billing on the 1st of November, and I'm going to repeat this through the end of next year. So you could say you would set up the fixed fee on date or milestone rule and then choose the option to repeat the billing rule. And you have several options in there, whether you want to repeat it monthly, quarterly, number of occurrences, and then your end date. And then you'll have one rule. It's not going to show up as 12 different rules or 13 different rules on your project. It'll have one rule, and then there's a note that says repeat monthly and then ending on X date. Retainers. These are, again, I touched on that invoice there. These are enabled by an internal switch to enable this feature. It can be associated with an agreement. However, it doesn't have to be. And that agreement really just puts a linear relationship into place if you want to make sure that your retainer is sticking with the same project, for example. And then your retainers allow for application of that money across projects, obviously for the same client. But if you wanted to associate maybe a retainer, if you've got 3 different projects with the same client and they've got a retainer and they want to pull from the retainer fund to put that money toward a second project that's just starting, you can certainly do that. And then to do that, once the invoice is generated on that properties form, there is an option with this feature enabled to indicate how much money you want to draw or use from the retainer and the actual date. In this case, I have my invoice date of 11/6 and my draw date of 11/6. And then when I put that in there, it does tell me in tiny, tiny little font underneath that, it will tell you what your available balance is. So if you tried to draw $11,000, I'm not going to be able to do that because I only had a total of $10,000 available, the $9,000 here, and then it tells me that I've got $10,000 just underneath that. I'm sorry, it tells me that I have $1,000 remaining underneath that, giving someone all kinds of money there. So again, as I mentioned, retainers can be associated with an agreement. There is a feature, and some of you might be using it already too, called the PO feature. And so there's some differences between those two. They are very similar, but also some differences. Agreements can be associated with a retainer, whereas a PO cannot. A PO is what it is, just all the same. You can have a retainer independent of an agreement or a retainer associated with an agreement, again, if you need to associate that then with a particular project. Again, both the agreements and the POs can be associated with multiple projects if you need, or they can be associated just with one project. And that tends to be the more common case is that I will see the agreements and or the POs associated with one particular project. There's not a right or wrong. It just needs to support your business. And then both of these can show on the invoice the drawdown amount and what's remaining on the PO or the agreement. So determining really if you've got just a PO and you need to burn down money from that, or if you need a retainer and you need to apply it across a bunch of different projects, for example, that would really be the difference between these. So different configurations here. Milestone completion, you've got your fixed fee on the date or milestone. The name of the rule is fixed fee on date or milestone, but again, working with that milestone completion, that's the key word that we want to focus in on there. And then you have an option when that milestone is completed to bill out the date or milestone is going to go on a date. There also is one, a fixed fee on percent complete, that you have the option to trigger a percent complete on a task and say, bill this when it's 100% complete, and maybe your configuration is such that when your task is marked closed, it equals 100% complete, at which point that will trigger for billing. So that milestone completed is, again, those are really date-based, and then the percent complete are when you would mark a milestone or a task complete. The renewal billing, this is if you wanted to set this up for, maybe I've got that example where I had, someone was being billed, once a month times 12 months, but maybe I need that reminder at the end of the 12 months whether or not they are going to renew. And in that case, what you could do is set up a milestone or a task on the particular project and set your start and or end date, whichever field you want to report on, as the date that they're due. And then if you create a report to monitor, it would tell you that your renewal billing is anticipated to come up on, for example, January 15th of 2019, for example. If you need to hold billing, another configuration with that. So for whatever reason, you're holding it because you can't invoice it based on client requests or based on your internal process, something, there's a customer sat issue. And so in that instance, I would create a charge stage, and you could name it something like on hold or pending, something to that effect. And you would set up the configuration so that that stage is excluded from invoicing, and that's a setting in the charge stages. From there, you could set up a report for the unbilled charges to report and make sure that you don't forget about those and go back to those, so that you've got a running tally to know what it is that you're expecting to bill at whatever point. And similar to the hold billing is a write-off. And again, this would be, you could set up something, separate charge stage called write-off, and exclude that stage from invoicing. With this, there really needs to be more process consideration as well. Who's making the decision to write off? Are you moving charges to the write-off on an ad hoc basis? Are they charges that have already been generated, but maybe there's been discussion you're not going to bill, certain charges from that list? Or are you going to, anything over, maybe you've got a prepaid amount or you've got a not to exceed agreement, and you've agreed to just not bill the customer for anything over X dollars, you can set up a billing rule that would say, we're going to bill you up to $10,000, and then set up a second billing rule that would say anything over $10,000 you're going to send to this charge stage. And I've actually got a screenshot of that on my next slide. But that's where you could say, we're going to send this to that area. And certainly with this, you absolutely would want to monitor this via reports to make sure that your write-offs, that the proper procedure is being followed, and that your write-offs aren't getting to some very, very high amount where it doesn't need to be addressed in a bigger capacity. So a couple little tips here. This one down here with the charge stage at the bottom, this is where you could set up a couple different billing rules where you've got billing rule 1, I'm billing up to a cap of X dollars, and anything over that, and I would have that in position 1. And then in position 2, I would have a rule that says, you know, effectively I'm just not going to bill those time entries and those charges by sending those directly to the charge stage of write-off. Certainly if you do need to, you know, bill those hours later, it's very easy. And the same with the on-hold billing, it's very easy to clear the charge stage and queue those up for billing. If you want, you can set a charge description where you automatically override what maybe gets entered on the description for the time entries. And you can say, I just want to call everything professional services. I don't care what someone writes in there. I want professional services to show up as my description, and as such, maybe just have that succinct wording show up on the invoice. So if you want to override that, you can set that at the billing rule level. Another trick, or something that I kind of like, if finance is not setting up the projects today, or if they are, and you just need a second validation or some sort of validation that it was set up correctly, perhaps having a field on your project properties form, like a checkbox or a drop-down, that indicates that finance has reviewed and approved the billing rules in particular on the project. And that could follow any sort of process. You can certainly set up permission rules that maybe you don't allow time entry unless finance has approved it, and then finance checks the box to allow time entry on the project. But having something there as a custom field to verify that a set of eyes have been on it and have validated the information is certainly not a bad idea. Some of the reports, if you're not familiar, the pending billings report is a fantastic report. This is probably the most common advanced reports, and the advanced reports have some sort of pre-built functionality in them. So underneath Reports Advanced, there's an option for pending billings. There also is one for pending recognition if you're using the recognition feature. What you could do, and you can certainly set filters in here, is when you run the pending billings report, you can see what is queued up to bill out for every project, or every project with, you know, the filters that you have selected. And then there's an option within that report to generate your charges right from that, so you don't have to go into individual projects and run charges from there. This allows you to do everything in bulk on some sort of scheduled or regular basis that you need to. There also, another great report is a milestone status report. So if you wanted to set this up, again, if you're looking at those anticipated completion dates of your milestones, choosing whether on that milestone that you would set up as a task within your project, choosing whether to use the start or the end date would be necessary, and then setting up a report, and I would set this up as a tabular or a detail report if you're using the old UI for reporting, and set something up that says, you know, your project name, your milestone name, or that task name really, and the start, or if you're using the end date. And then you can look and see, you know, are we anticipating having, you know, design completion finished, you know, by 11:30, or has that pushed out, for example? And then you've got your pending billings, which would reflect accordingly once that milestone is marked complete. So this just gives you a way to monitor the dates and make sure that, you know, if you see something that was supposed to have been completed back in August, you know, hey, was it completed and we need to mark it as such, or did it get pushed and it's no longer going to be completed, obviously, in August, and now it's been pushed out to December and no one updated the date. So following up on and looking at those dates there. If you're using the retainers, a couple nice reports exist to look at the retainer balances and the retainer activity. So similar as when you're in the invoice and you have the balance detail there, if you don't want to always go into an invoice or if you get a question on what the balance is, there's an easy report, and again, this is advanced reports at the client level. You can see that you've got, for example, my KeyHex project, I've got an available balance of $1,000, but I had received a $10,000 retainer, so quick math there, obviously they've used $9,000 of it. For any other my clients here, I can see that they've got a balance of 0 and what the original retainer amount was for. Same thing with the activity. If you wanted to look and see where the money was applied and when, you can see that there was a draw on invoice number 3791, and that was for $9,000, leaving me with a balance of $1,000. So the retainer feature is actually really nice in that regard. So again, in summary, OpenAir, they do have a very robust billing platform, and it supports a variety of configurations. A number of the items that I've talked about, the retainers, for example, the agreements, associating retainers with agreements. Some of those are controlled by internal switches, so you might need to enable the internal switches accordingly. And then keeping in mind, too, that you can have multiple billing rules, and the billing rule position is critical, especially, like I said, in the example of you're going to bill an amount up to $10,000. Anything over that, you're going to send to your write-off stage, or maybe you're going to send to your on-hold stage and then have a conversation with your client later, making sure that's in position number 2 to catch anything that straggles through. And then obviously making sure that your billing data is accurate is a big piece. So validating setup and making sure that things are set up before your project begins and before time entries start. Reporting during the project and on a proactive basis so that you're not catching things after the fact and having to do a lot of time-consuming and laborious cleanup, and then taking action accordingly. Do you need to update milestone dates? Do you need to go back, have further conversations with your client? What is it that needs to happen based on the reporting and the data that you're bringing up?